In a Greenwich law office, a disinherited daughter was about to discover her hidden power. What started as a devastating will reading took a shocking turn when she learned her mother had cut her out completely. Sharmane Michelle Mitchell wasn't your typical family disappointment. For years, she had chosen principle over profit, known for her unwavering compassion despite constant rejection. When she faced complete disinheritance, she had no idea she was already worth $15 million through her father's secret trust fund. Her devastating loss would become the foundation for transforming her family's toxic legacy forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany conference table felt cold beneath Sharmane Michelle's fingertips as she traced its polished surface, avoiding the weight of James Morrison's steady gaze. The law office smelled of leather and old money, a scent that had once meant security, but now felt suffocating. 3 days had passed since her mother's funeral, and the black dress she wore still carried the faint smell of cemetery earth and wilted lilies. As executor of Victoria Mitchell's estate, James began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who'd delivered difficult news before, I'm required to read the will in its entirety. Marcus shifted in his chair beside her, the leather creaking under his weight. He hadn't looked at her directly since they had arrived, his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Greenwich. The golden afternoon light caught the premature silver threading through his dark hair. Stress, she knew, though he'd never admit it. Sharmane Michelle's hands stilled on the table. Something in James's tone felt wrong, like a familiar song played in a minor key. She'd known him since childhood. He'd been her father's law partner, her family's trusted advisor, but today his usual warmth was replaced by professional distance. Quote, I, Victoria Elizabeth Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby distribute my assets as follows, end quote. The words blurred together at first. The Connecticut estate, Marcus. The business holdings, Marcus. The investment portfolio, Marcus. Her grandmother's antique jewelry collection, Marcus. Each bequest hit like a physical blow, and Sharmane Michelle found herself holding her breath, waiting for her name to appear. It never did. To my daughter, Sharmane Michelle Mitchell, James's voice faltered slightly, I leave nothing. She has made her choices, and I have made mine, end quote. The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang unanswered. Traffic hummed on the street below. Life continued, indifferent to the way her world had just crumbled. Marcus finally turned to look at her, his face pale beneath his expensive tan. Charm, I don't. The word came out sharper than she had intended. She could feel tears threatening, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Not here, not now. The memory came unbidden. She was 8 years old, standing in the pristine living room of their Darien estate. Her mother's voice, crystal clear, Sharmane Michelle, stop making that face. No one likes a child who questions everything. Marcus understands this. Why can't you be more like your brother? End quote. She'd been asking why the housekeeper's daughter couldn't come to her birthday party. A simple question from a child who didn't understand class distinctions. But Victoria had seen it as defiance, as proof that her daughter would never fit the mold she had carefully constructed. There must be some mistake, Marcus said, his voice tight with something that might have been genuine concern or guilt. Mom wouldn't what? Sharmane Michelle's laugh came out bitter. Wouldn't punish me for being exactly who I've always been, for choosing social work over the family business, for asking questions instead of just nodding along. James cleared his throat, shuffling the papers with hands that seemed less steady than usual. I'm afraid there's no mistake. The will was updated 6 months ago, and Mrs. Mitchell was very specific about her intentions. 6 months ago? Right around the time Charmaine Michelle had refused to attend the charity gala at the country club, the one where Victoria had planned to announce Marcus's engagement to a senator's daughter. The engagement that had fallen apart 3 months later when Marcus's gambling debts came to light. Not that Victoria had ever acknowledged that particular failure. Charm, listen. Marcus stood, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the table. She looked up at her brother, really looked at him for the first time in months. The expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost, or the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. The golden child was tarnishing, but he still expected her to play her assigned role, the grateful little sister, thankful for whatever scraps fell from his table. Figure what out, Marcus? She stood as well, her modest height forcing her to crane her neck to meet his eyes. How to make me feel better about being completely erased from my own mother's will? How to pretend this is exactly what she wanted? To make sure I knew my place one final time? James was studying them both with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something in his eyes. Guilt? Sympathy? Knowledge he wasn't sharing? Another memory surfaced. Christmas morning when she was 12, she'd given their housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, a handmade card thanking her for always listening and never judging. Victoria had been furious, pulling Sharmane Michelle aside later. You embarrass this family with your bleeding heart nonsense. Charity is for tax write-offs and photo opportunities, not genuine feeling. When will you learn that sentiment is a luxury we can't afford? But their father had found the card later, smoothed out from the trash where Victoria had thrown it. He'd kept it in his desk drawer, and sometimes Sharmane Michelle would catch him reading it with a small, sad smile. She hated who I am, Sharmane Michelle said quietly, the words feeling like stones in her throat. She spent my entire life trying to break me down and rebuild me into something acceptable, someone compliant, someone who wouldn't ask why we had 6 bedrooms when Mrs. Rodriguez's family of 4 lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. Marcus flinched. That's not... She loved you, in her own way. Her way was conditional. Sharmane Michelle gathered her purse, suddenly desperate to escape the suffocating weight of family expectations and disappointed love. Love doesn't come with terms and conditions, Marcus. Real love doesn't require you to be someone else to earn it. James was watching her with an intensity that made her pause. Sharmane Michelle, perhaps we could schedule a private meeting. There are some matters regarding your father's estate that... No. She was already moving toward the door. I'm done with family meetings. I'm done with all of it. Marcus followed her into the hallway, his voice echoing off the marble floors. Charm, please, don't let her win like this. Don't let her drive us apart. She turned back to face him, and for a moment she saw not the successful businessman in the tailored suit, but the scared little boy who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms before Victoria decided such displays of vulnerability were unacceptable in her perfect son. She hated who I am. Marcus, she got exactly what she wanted. You, successful and acceptable, carrying on the family name and reputation, and me, reminded one last time that I never measured up. The elevator arrived with a soft chime and she stepped inside. Marcus reached out as if to follow, but something in her expression stopped him. Sharmane Michelle, wait! The doors slid shut on his outstretched hand. As the elevator descended, Sharmane Michelle caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. 28 years old, wearing a discount dress she'd bought for the funeral, clutching a purse that had seen better years. She looked exactly like what she was, the family disappointment, the daughter who'd chosen principle over profit, heart over status. For the first time since learning of her mother's final act of rejection, she felt something unexpected flickering beneath the hurt and anger. Relief. The performance was over. She no longer had to pretend that Victoria's love was worth earning, or that family loyalty meant accepting emotional abuse as the price of belonging. She walked through the lobby with her head high, past oil paintings of stern-faced partners and polished brass nameplates that proclaimed decades of legal excellence. The afternoon sun hit her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk, and she breathed deeply for what felt like the first time in days. Her phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. We'll talk soon. I meant what I said. She deleted it without responding and started walking toward her car, a 10-year-old Honda that stood out like a sore thumb among the Mercedes and BMWs in the parking garage. As she drove away from Morrison and Associates, away from the last remnants of her mother's final manipulation, a memory began to surface. Her father, weak and fading in his hospital bed 5 years ago, gripping her hand with surprising strength, his voice barely a whisper. "I made sure you'll be taken care of, sweetheart. When the time comes, remember David Thompson. Remember what I told you about taking care of your future." At the time, she assumed he was delirious from the pain medication. But now, as the shock of her disinheritance began to fade, those words echoed with new significance. David Thompson, her old college friend who'd become a financial advisor, the same David who had once helped her father with some investment decisions. What if her father had known exactly who Victoria really was? What if he had made his own preparations? Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For the first time in 3 days, Sharmane Michelle felt something other than grief. She felt hope. Sharmane Michelle's apartment felt smaller than usual as she sat cross-legged on her worn carpet, the wooden box containing her father's belongings spread open before her. The hope that had flickered during her drive home now battled with doubt as she sorted through the familiar contents: his reading glasses, his wedding ring, letters he'd written but never sent. The business card was tucked behind a photograph of her college graduation. David Thompson, Financial Advisory Services. The edges were worn as if her father had handled it often. She remembered David vaguely, tall, serious, someone who had made her laugh during study sessions when the world felt too heavy. Her phone felt foreign in her trembling hands as she dialed the number. It rang twice before his voice answered, deeper than she remembered but unmistakably familiar. David Thompson.
David? It's Sharmane Michelle Mitchell from college. The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if he'd hung up. Then quietly, "Sharmane Michelle, I wondered when you'd call." Something in his tone made her stomach flutter. Not surprise, expectation, as if he'd been waiting. "You knew I would? Your father made me promise to wait for you to reach out first. He said you'd call when you were ready." His voice carried a weight she didn't understand. "I'm so sorry about Victoria. The funeral was beautiful." "You were there?" The words stuck in her throat. She hadn't noticed him among the sea of Victoria's society friends and business associates. "David, my father said something before he died, about taking care of my future, about you. I felt foolish saying it. I thought maybe you'd know what he meant." Another pause. Then, "Can we meet tomorrow? There's something I need to show you. Something your father asked me to keep safe until you were ready to understand." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Ready to understand what? That your father loved you more than you ever knew, and that he made sure Victoria could never truly hurt you. The line went quiet except for their breathing. Sharmane Michelle closed her eyes, remembering her father's gentle hands smoothing her hair when Victoria's criticism had cut too deep. "Tomorrow," David said softly. 1 o'clock at the cafe on Asylum Street near your office. You still work at Hartford Social Services." Of course he knew where I worked. The question was how much else he knew. "Yes," she whispered. "Sharmane Michelle?" His voice was gentle now, almost protective. "Your father was very proud of who you became. He wanted you to know that." After he hung up, she sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment, holding her father's business card like a lifeline. Outside, traffic hummed through the streets of her modest neighborhood, a world away from the Greenwich estate where she'd grown up feeling like an unwelcome guest. Tomorrow, she would learn what her father had really meant. Tonight, for the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been as alone as she'd thought. The cafe on Asylum Street buzzed with the lunch crowd. But Sharmane Michelle barely noticed the conversations swirling around her. She'd arrived 10 minutes early, nursing a coffee that had gone cold while she watched the door. When David Thompson walked in, she recognized him immediately, despite the years. The same thoughtful eyes, though now framed by expensive glasses, the same careful way of moving through the world. He aged well. Success suited him, evident in his tailored suit and confident bearing. But when their eyes met, she saw something vulnerable there, almost nervous. Sharmane Michelle. He slid into the booth across from her, setting down a leather briefcase with deliberate care. You look exactly the same. I almost laughed. I look like someone who just found out her mother hated her enough to write her out of existence. Your mother was afraid of you, David said quietly. Your father knew that. Afraid of me? David opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Your father came to me 7 years ago, not long after Victoria started pressuring you to join the family business. He said he could see what was happening, how she was trying to break your spirit, to rebuild you in her image. Sharmane Michelle's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee. He never said anything. He was protecting you the only way he knew how. David's fingers traced the folder's edge. He established a trust fund, Sharmane Michelle, substantial enough that Victoria could never use money as a weapon against you. The cafe noise faded to a dull hum. What do you mean, substantial? David opened the folder, revealing documents that swam before her eyes, numbers that didn't make sense, investment portfolios, bank statements. $15.3 million, he said softly, growing at approximately 8% annually. It's been waiting for you since your 25th birthday. The world tilted. Sharmane Michelle gripped the table's edge, feeling like she might slide off her chair. That's impossible. I'm a social worker. I drive a Honda. I bite generic cereal. By choice, David said gently. You could have accessed this at any time in the last 3 years, but your father instructed me never to contact you directly. He wanted you to choose your own path, without the influence of wealth. He said if you never needed it, that would be proof he'd raised a daughter with genuine values. Tears blurred her vision. All those times I worried about rent? About student loans? He watched you choose principle over comfort again and again. He was so proud. David leaned forward. There's more, Sharmane Michelle. Your father suspected Victoria might try something like this, Will. He wanted you to have options. She thought about Marcus, inheriting everything but drowning in debt he was too proud to admit. About Victoria's final act of cruelty, designed to leave her feeling worthless and abandoned. Why are you telling me this now? David's expression darkened. Because Marcus is in serious trouble, the kind that could destroy everything your father built, everything your grandmother built before him. And because... He hesitated. Because I think your father always hoped you'd be the one to save the family legacy, not from financial ruin, but from itself.
Outside the cafe window, Hartford bustled with ordinary life. People worried about ordinary problems. But inside this booth, Sharmane Michelle sat with the knowledge that she was worth more than she'd ever imagined, holding the power to change everything. The question was, what would she do with it? Marcus's hands shook as he signed the loan papers, the pen leaving uneven scratches across the signature line. The office reeked of cheap cologne and desperation, fitting since he'd brought plenty of the latter with him. 30 days, Mitchell, the man across the desk said, not bothering to look up from counting the cash. Tony Castellano had the kind of face that belonged in police lineups, all sharp angles and cold eyes. Interest compounds daily after that. I understand. Marcus pocketed the money, $50,000 that would barely make a dent in what he owed. My inheritance clears probate next week. You'll have everything then. Tony's laugh was like broken glass. Your inheritance? The one that's tied up in legal complications? The estate that's mortgaged to the foundation? Marcus's blood went cold. What are you talking about? I do my homework, golden boy. That pretty house in Darien, it's collateral on 3 different loans your dear departed mama took out. The business? Hemorrhaging money faster than you pissed it away at those poker games in Atlantic City. The room spun slightly. Marcus gripped the armrests of his chair, fighting nausea. That's impossible. The will reading showed you inheriting debt disguised as assets. Tony leaned back, enjoying the show. Funny how your sister got cut out completely. Maybe Mommy knew something you didn't. Marcus thought about Sharmane Michelle's face in the law office, the way she'd looked at him with something between pity and disgust. He'd assumed it was about the inheritance, about their mother's final cruelty. But what if she'd known? What if she'd seen through Victoria's carefully constructed facade? His phone buzzed. Another text from his ex-wife's lawyer about missed alimony payments. Another from his bookie about Sunday's losses. The walls of his carefully maintained life were crumbling, and everyone could see the rot underneath. I need more time, he whispered. Tony stood, straightening his expensive suit. Time's a luxury you can't afford, college boy. You've got until the end of the month to produce $200,000, or we start collecting in other ways. Marcus stumbled out of the office into the harsh afternoon light. His Mercedes, the one he couldn't afford to lose because it was the last thing maintaining his image, sat in the parking lot like a monument to his failures. He'd spent his entire life being the perfect son, the golden child who never questioned, never failed, never showed weakness. Victoria had molded him into her ideal, and he'd been too afraid to resist. But perfection had its price, and he'd been paying it in increasingly dangerous ways. As he drove through downtown Hartford, passing the social services building where his sister worked helping people with nothing, Marcus realized the bitter truth. Sharmane Michelle, the family disappointment, had chosen authenticity over approval. She'd built a life based on her own values, however modest. He'd chosen the gilded cage, and now he was trapped inside it, watching it crumble around him. The question was whether his pride would allow him to ask for help before it was too late. The assisted living facility smelled of antiseptic and artificial flowers, but Margaret Sullivan had traces of the formidable woman she'd always been. Sharmane Michelle knocked gently on the door marked 4B, still reeling from David's revelation about the trust fund. Come in, child. I've been expecting you. At 89, Maggie remained sharp as cut glass, her silver hair perfectly styled, her blue eyes missing nothing. She gestured towards a worn velvet chair that once graced the family estate's library. Grandmother, I need to ask you something. About the trust fund your father left you, it wasn't a question. Maggie poured tea from a delicate china set, her hands steady despite her age. David Thompson is a good man. Your father chose well. Sharmane Michelle's cup rattled against its saucer. You knew? I helped him plan it. Maggie settled into her chair with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to command. Your father was my son in every way that mattered. Gentle, principled, protective of those he loved. He saw what Victoria was doing to you and refused to let it continue. The apartment walls were covered with photographs spanning decades. Maggie as a young woman breaking ground on her first real estate development, family gatherings from better times, Sharmane Michelle's college graduation where her parents had argued quietly in the background. I built this family's fortune with nothing but determination and common sense. Started with a single rental property in 1958 and turned it into an empire. But Victoria never understood that wealth is a tool, not a weapon.
Sharmane Michelle set down her cup, her hands trembling. Mother cut me out completely. She wanted me to know I was nothing. Maggie's eyes flashed with anger, the first real emotion she'd shown. Victoria was afraid of you from the moment you were born. You had something she never possessed, authenticity. You couldn't be bought, couldn't be molded into her perfect image. That terrified her.
And Marcus? Poor boy. Maggie shook her head sadly. Golden children suffer just as much as scapegoats, just differently. Victoria destroyed his backbone trying to make him her masterpiece. Now he's drowning in debt and too proud to admit failure. Sharmane Michelle jerked upright. You know about Marcus's problems? Child, I may be old, but I'm not blind. I've been quietly paying some of his smaller creditors to buy him time. But the gambling debts, the failed business ventures, those are beyond my ability to fix without destroying what's left of his self-respect. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Even from her assisted living facility, Maggie had been protecting the family, managing crises none of them knew about. Why didn't you tell me about the trust fund? Maggie's smile was gentle but knowing. Because your father was right. You needed to choose your own path without the corruption of easy money. You needed to prove, to yourself more than anyone, that you were worthy of what he left you. She reached across the small space between their chairs and took Sharmane Michelle's hand in her papery grip. You have a choice now, dear one. You can walk away from this family's poison and build something new with David. Yes, I see how he looks at you. Or you can use what your father gave you to heal what Victoria broke. Outside the window, afternoon shadows lengthened across the facility's manicured browns. Sharmane Michelle felt the weight of generations settling on her shoulders, the legacy of Maggie's determination, her father's love, and the destructive patterns that had nearly destroyed them all. What would you do? She whispered. Maggie's eyes twinkled with the fierce intelligence that had built an empire. I'd save my family, but on my own terms, not theirs. The master bedroom of the Darien estate felt like a mausoleum, all pristine white linens and the medicinal smell of expensive dyeing. Victoria lay propped against silk pillows, her once commanding presence reduced to sharp cheekbones and paper-thin skin, but her eyes retained their calculating gleam. Sharmane Michelle stood in the doorway, gathering courage she'd never possessed in this house. I wondered when you'd come. Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the same dismissive tone that had shaped 30 years of conversations. We need to talk. Sharmane Michelle stepped into the room, noting how Victoria's gaze immediately assessed her discount clothing, her untamed hair, her defiant posture. About what? Your continued disappointment in being my daughter? The words should have stung. Once, they would have sent Sharmane Michelle retreating, apologizing for existing. Instead, she felt something new, clarity. About the truth. About how you spent my entire life trying to break me because I reminded you of everything you were afraid to be. Victoria's laugh turned into a cough. Afraid? I built this family from nothing. I secured our future. You married into wealth because you were terrified of being poor again. Sharmane Michelle moved closer, her voice steady. Dad told me about your childhood, the foster homes, the hunger. I understand why you were scared. For a moment, Victoria's mask slipped. Behind the aristocratic facade was a frightened girl who'd learned that love was earned through performance. You understand nothing, Victoria whispered. I gave you everything, the best schools, the finest opportunities. All you had to do was appreciate it. You gave me conditions, love with strings attached, a family where acceptance required me to become someone entirely else. Victoria's eyes flashed with old anger. Because sentiment is weakness. Because bleeding hearts like you get destroyed by people like me. I was trying to protect you. By destroying who I was? By making you stronger. Victoria struggled to sit up straighter. Marcus understood this. He became successful, respected. Marcus is drowning. The words came out harder than Sharmane Michelle intended.
Your perfect son is broken, mother. Just like me. Just like you. The silence stretched between them. 30 years of accumulated damage laid bare. Victoria's breathing grew labored, but her eyes never left her daughter's face. I won't apologize, Victoria said finally. I did what I thought was best. I know. Sharmane Michelle felt tears threaten, but her voice remained steady. And I'm done trying to earn love that was never really available. She turned toward the door, feeling lighter with each step. Sharmane Michelle, Victoria's voice was barely audible. You'll see, when I'm gone, you'll understand what family loyalty really costs.
3 weeks later, seated in James Morrison's office, Sharmane Michelle finally understood. Victoria's final lesson had been her cruelest and most liberating. The knock came at 11:30 at night, tentative but insistent. Sharmane Michelle opened her apartment door to find Marcus swaying slightly in the hallway, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face ashen. The smell of whiskey clung to him like expensive cologne gone wrong. "Charm," his voice cracked on her name. Can I come in?" She stepped aside, watching as her brother, always so composed, so perfectly put together, stumbled into her modest living room. He looked around at her secondhand furniture, her small television, the social work textbooks stacked on her coffee table, as if seeing them for the first time. "You want some coffee?" she asked, closing the door. "I want to tell you the truth." He collapsed onto her couch, his head in his hands. "About everything. About the inheritance, about Mom, about what I've done." Sharmane Michelle settled into the chair across from him, the same chair where she'd sat just days ago processing David's revelation about the trust fund. Her brother looked broken in a way she'd never seen. Not polished Marcus, not the golden child who'd never failed at anything. "I'm listening." "The poker games started in college, just for fun at first. But then I realized I was good at it, and the money... God, Charm, the money felt like proof that I was special, that I deserved everything Mom said I did." She waited, recognizing the careful way he was building up to something larger. "After Dad died, when Mom got sicker, the pressure got worse. Every conversation was about carrying on the family name, about being worthy of the legacy. I started betting more, losing more." He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Do you know what it's like to be someone's entire reason for living?" The question hit harder than she'd expected. "No, I know what it's like to be someone's entire disappointment." Marcus's laugh was bitter. "We're both casualties, aren't we? Just different kinds." He stood abruptly, pacing to her small window that overlooked the parking lot. "I'm $200,000 in debt, Charm, to the kind of people who don't accept payment plans or sob stories. The inheritance, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Mom mortgaged everything trying to keep up appearances after Dad's medical bills." The words hung in the air between them. Sharmane Michelle thought about Tony Castellano, about the threats Marcus was facing, about the desperate loan he had taken that afternoon. The estate, the business holdings, all of its leverage to the foundation. He turned back to her, his face a mask of shame. "I inherited debt disguised as wealth, and I'm drowning in both." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've been an ass to you for 30 years, and I'm probably going to die for it. Because Mom trained me to see you as competition instead of family, and I was too weak to think for myself." He dropped back onto the couch, his hands shaking. "Do you remember when we were kids? Before Mom decided we had to be different, you used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms. You were afraid of the lightning. I was afraid of everything, but you weren't. Even as a little kid, you'd stand up to her when she was being cruel. You'd defend Mrs. Rodriguez when Mom criticized her English. You'd ask why we needed 3 cars when families in town didn't have one." He looked at her with something like wonder. "I always envied that. Your courage." Sharmane Michelle felt tears burning behind her eyes. This was the brother she'd lost somewhere along the way. Not Victoria's creation, but the scared little boy who'd crawled under her covers when the world felt too big and frightening.
I don't deserve your help, Marcus whispered, but I'm asking anyway. Not for money, I know you don't have any to spare. Just forgiveness, I guess, before it's too late. She looked at her brother, really looked at him, and saw not the golden child or the family heir, but a broken man finally telling the truth. In her mind, she heard David's voice. $15.3 million. The power to save him sat in a trust fund he didn't know existed. The question was whether salvation required truth or whether some mercies were meant to remain secret. After Marcus left, Sharmane Michelle sat in the darkness of her living room until dawn, her brother's words echoing in her mind. The weight of $15 million had never felt heavier than in those quiet hours when the power to change everything rested in her hands like a loaded weapon. At 7 a.m., she called David. I need to see you, today, about accessing the trust fund. His office felt different in the morning light, more real, more consequential. The documents spread across his mahogany desk represented not just numbers, but choices that would define who she was becoming. There are several options, David said, his fingers tracing columns of figures. You could pay off Marcus's debts directly. $200,000 would clear everything. Or buy back the family assets before they're foreclosed. The estate alone could be yours for $3 million. Sharmane Michelle studied the papers, seeing her father's love translated into financial strategy. What did he want me to do with it? He hoped you'd use it to heal the family, but on your terms, not theirs. David leaned back in his chair. He also knew you might choose to walk away entirely, build something new with someone who sees your worth. The unspoken implication hung between them. Someone like David, who had protected her inheritance for years without expecting anything in return.
There's a third option, she said slowly, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. What if I didn't just pay off debts or buy back property? What if I restructured everything? David's eyes sharpened with interest. What do you mean? The estate becomes a community center, social services, addiction counseling, financial literacy programs. The business assets get folded into a foundation focused on breaking generational poverty. She looked up from the documents, feeling something click into place. Marcus gets help, real help, not just money, but he has to earn it through recovery and service. That's ambitious, David's voice carried admiration, and risky. You'd be gambling everything on people's ability to change. My father gambled $15 million on my ability to change, on the belief that I'd choose healing over revenge. She met his eyes. Maybe it's time to find out if Marcus can choose healing, too. David pulled out a fresh legal pad and began sketching organizational charts. It would take months to set up properly. Lawyers, board structure, program development, and Marcus would have to agree to the conditions. He's facing death threats from loan sharks. I think he'll be motivated. They worked through lunch, mapping out a vision that transformed inherited wealth into inherited purpose. By evening, Sharmane Michelle had a plan that would either save her family or prove definitively that some patterns were too broken to repair. As David walked her to her car, he touched her arm gently. Your father would be proud of this choice. What about you? The question surprised her with its boldness. His smile was warm and genuine. I'm proud to help you build something worthy of who you are. Driving home, Sharmane Michelle felt the strangest sensation. Not the weight of burden, but the lightness of purpose. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate work of resurrection. Tonight, she would call her brother and offer him something Victoria never had. Love without conditions, help with accountability, and a chance to become the man he was meant to be. The transformation began at dawn on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks after Sharmane Michelle's decision. She stood in the marble foyer of Morrison Associates, but this time she wasn't the devastated daughter receiving crushing news. This time she was the client with the $15 million plan and the will to execute it. James Morrison looked older than his 45 years as he reviewed the legal documents spread across his conference table. This is unprecedented, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. You're essentially restructuring your entire family's financial existence. With their consent, Sharmane Michelle clarified, though her tone made it clear consent was expected, not negotiated.
David sat beside her, his role having evolved from protector to partner in ways that extended far beyond the financial. Over the past 3 weeks, their late-night planning sessions had revealed depths to both of them that surprised even her. He was brilliant, ethical, and patient, qualities that made her father's choice of guardians suddenly seem prophetic. "Marcus is here," James announced as his secretary knocked. "Should I bring him in?" Sharmane Michelle nodded, steeling herself for what would either be her brother's salvation or their final confrontation. Marcus entered looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. His usual polish was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed appearance of a man who'd stared into the abyss of his own making. He stopped short when he saw the documents, the official notary, the gravity of the assembled group. "What is this?" His voice was hoarse, suspicious. "Your rescue," Sharmane Michelle said simply. "Sit down." She watched him process the information as James read through the terms. The immediate payment of all his debts, not just to the loan sharks, but every gambling debt, every creditor, every failed business venture, the purchase of the family estate and business holdings before foreclosure, the establishment of the Sullivan Mitchell Foundation with a mandate to address addiction, poverty, and family dysfunction. Marcus's face went through a series of changes: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked like terror. "How?" he whispered. "How is this possible? You're a social worker. You drive a Honda." "I drive a Honda by choice." Sharmane Michelle leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "Dad left me a trust fund, $15.3 million, managed by David for the past 7 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at her as if she'd revealed she was an alien being, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "You've been rich this whole time?" His voice cracked. "While I've been drowning, while I've been terrified for my life, you've been sitting on $15 million? While you've been perpetuating the same toxic patterns that destroyed our family?" Sharmane Michelle corrected, her voice steady but not unkind. "Yes." Marcus shot to his feet, pacing to the windows that overlooked Greenwich's manicured downtown. "This is insane! You let me suffer! You let me think I was alone!" "You were never alone. You were proud." Sharmane Michelle stood as well, facing her brother across the expanse of mahogany and years of accumulated hurt. "How many times did you call me for help? How many times did you acknowledge that I might have value beyond being your disappointing little sister?"
David cleared his throat gently. "Marcus, there are conditions." The word conditions seemed to snap Marcus back to attention. He returned to his seat, his businessman instincts finally engaging with the reality of what was being offered. "Mandatory residential addiction treatment for 6 months," James read from the documents, followed by 2 years of supervised recovery, including regular counseling and financial oversight. Active participation in the Foundation's programs, starting as a volunteer and potentially advancing to paid positions based on demonstrated commitment and sobriety. Marcus's face cycled through emotions: relief, resentment, fear, and finally something that might have been hope. "And if I refuse?" "Then you refuse," Sharmane Michelle said simply. "The Foundation gets established anyway. The estate becomes a community center serving families dealing with addiction and financial crisis. You face your creditors alone, and we never speak again." "That's not much of a choice." "It's more choice than you gave me for 30 years. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "It's more choice than Mom ever gave either of us." Marcus looked around the room, at James, who'd watched their family disintegrate over decades, at David, who'd protected Sharmane Michelle's interests with quiet devotion, at his sister, who'd somehow transformed from victim to architect of salvation. "The treatment program," he said quietly. "It's real recovery, not some country club detox." "Real recovery," David confirmed. "The kind that requires you to face everything you've done and everyone you've hurt, including yourself." Marcus closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms. When he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking, "for all of it.
for how I treated you, for the choices I made, for wasting so much time being who she wanted instead of who I was. I know. Sharmane Michelle felt tears threatening but didn't fight them. The question is whether you're ready to find out who you actually are. Marcus picked up the pen James offered him. His hand shook slightly as he signed the documents that would restructure his entire existence. When do I start? Tomorrow, she said. We all start tomorrow. Outside the law office windows, Greenwich bustled with its usual rhythm of wealth and privilege. But inside the conference room, something unprecedented was taking shape. A family choosing healing over habit, growth over comfort, and love without conditions over the familiar patterns of conditional acceptance. The rescue was complete. The real work was just beginning. 6 months later, Sharmane Michelle stood in Victoria's former dining room, watching 8-year-old Maria Gonzalez practice multiplication at the mahogany table that had once hosted Greenwich's most exclusive dinner parties. The child's laughter echoed off walls that had known only polite conversation and carefully guarded secrets. "She's making real progress," said Carmen Rodriguez, the foundation's education coordinator and daughter of their former housekeeper. 3 months ago, she couldn't multiply past the 5s. Through the windows, Sharmane Michelle could see the estate's transformation. The tennis court converted to a community garden, the pool house hosting support groups for addiction recovery and financial counseling. "Sharmane Michelle?" David appeared in the doorway, suit jacket over his arm. He'd been meeting with the board about expanding to New Haven and Bridgeport. "How did it go?" she asked. "Full funding approved, and..." He pulled out a cream envelope. "Grandmother's will. James called. She passed peacefully last night." Maggie had been 91, sharp until the end. With trembling fingers, Sharmane Michelle opened the envelope. "To my granddaughter Sharmane Michelle, who understood that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give away. The remainder of my estate, $4 million, goes to the Sullivan Mitchell Foundation. You have become the woman I always hoped you would be. Your father would be so proud." "She believed in you from the beginning," David said gently. A commotion from the hall drew their attention. Marcus stood in the foyer, duffel bag over his shoulder, his face healthier than she'd seen in years. 6 months of sobriety had stripped away Victoria's artificial polish, revealing her actual brother. "Surprise!" he grinned tentatively. "They said I could come home early for good behavior."
Sharmane Michelle embraced him. He smelled like soap and possibility, no longer carrying the desperate edge of someone running from himself. "Welcome home," she whispered. "It's not the same home," he said, looking around with wonder. "No," she agreed. "It's better." Over dinner, Marcus shared stories from treatment. The hard work of examining his relationship with money and approval. David updated them on the Foundation's growing waiting list of families seeking services. Later in the garden, where Victoria had once lectured her about appropriate behavior, Sharmane Michelle stood among tomato plants tended by people from all backgrounds working together. David joined her, taking her hand. "Any regrets?" he asked, looking back at the house glowing with warm light. A year ago, she'd been the disinherited daughter, the family disappointment driving a Honda and buying generic cereal. Now she was the architect of transformation, keeper of a legacy redefined. "None," she said, meaning it completely. Her phone buzzed. A text from Carmen. "Maria got 100% on her math test. She wanted you to know." Sharmane Michelle smiled, thinking about inheritance and legacy, about how love travels through generations. Victoria had tried to pass down control and conditional acceptance, but real love created something different. Courage, compassion, and the radical belief that people could change. Standing in the garden, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and the community she'd helped build, Sharmane Michelle finally understood what her father had known all along. The greatest inheritance wasn't money or property or even forgiveness. It was the power to begin again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.